I am tired from carrying the memories, tired of telling them, but there is no rest for us. There is no time to process our sorrow because the stories and conflicts goes on. Can we tell our children that it is over? Can we forget and move on? Can we tell ourselves that future will be brighter? Question to be answered in the future. I would like to ask for apology from the survivors. My generation has failed. We were supposed to right the wrongs. We were supposed to end up the nightmare. I am so sorry for what you have to see and hear in your lifetime again in Europe. We see the same propaganda, the same racist rhetoric, and the same violence growing as in the 1930s. What happens when the amount of people that openly call themselves racists is growing in Europe? We are even seeing European states making open racist remarks. The lack of political will, the lack of humanity is killing Roma and Sinti in Europe today. The incapacity to regard Roma as human beings of equal value and rights is killing Roma in Europe today. I was born condemned. I was second-class citizen all my life. I lived this nightmare for too many years. I would like to live the dream where we all are equal. And I will make a personal note. My father, half German, half Jewish, came to Sweden in 1955. He survived Holocaust. He met my mother, and he thought that the future will be bright. My mother is Roma, Sinti. My mother was made to go through a forced abortion and sterilization in her 7 months of pregnancy because of her ethnicity. This was in Sweden, 1959. There was no war or racist propaganda. It happened with help of the quiet consensus. I will end up with sharing my 3 truths. I got them many years ago from a Jewish friend, a survivor. And I would like to share them with you, and I would like you to keep them in your heart. The 3 truths are: there is only one race, the human. There is only one religion, love. There is only one world, or no world at all.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Małgorzata Kołaczek. I am a researcher at the Jagiellonian University, but also a vice president and co-founder of Foundation Towards Dialogue, which is a partner organization in the project Hear the Other. And we are so grateful to be invited to be part of this very important project and hear the voices of others, and empowering the leaders of minority communities has always been a very important goal for us. And it's also very visible in our 10 years of activities in the third sector in Poland, but also in Europe. I started with the clip of the Soraya Post testimony during the 71st anniversary of the Tsigoiner Lager liquidation in the former Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, because of two reasons. The first reason is that Soraya is sharing her personal story, as well as talking about the experience of Second World War, is showing the continuation and ongoing trauma of Romani communities, Roma, Sinti, Manouche, Kale, Romani Chal, and many different groups that are right now called Roma, or were called historically and still are being called in many contexts in a negative manner, gypsies. She's showing in very short but very powerful testimony the connection between what happened before the Second War, during the war, and what is happening now. The mechanism of discrimination, persecution, annihilation. And this is the very important part of many minority, especially Jewish and Romani organizations' missions to commemorate the history, but also prevent and combat discrimination, hate speech, hate crimes in current situation, current European times that we are in contemporary Europe. But the second reason was also that Soraya's history, her personal story, is also a connection between Jewish and Romani communities. And in regards to the commemoration of Romani Holocaust, or sometimes called genocide by some institutions, or called Poraimos, Paraimos, Samudaripen, and many different names that I will talk about a little bit later on, is also connected with the support and help of the Jewish communities, which representatives are very oftenly every year present during the commemoration of 2nd of August, the most symbolic and important date in regards to commemoration and honoring the victims, but also those who survived the Second World War and the persecution of the Nazi regime. The connection between the Jewish community and Romani community is not only during the Second World War, but many times the attitudes of European societies towards both of those groups were hostile, were very much rooted in stereotypes, prejudice, and were very discriminatory. And we can observe that also today. We are talking about anti-Semitism in different forms and shapes, but also anti-Gypsyism or Romaphobia, which I will also talk about a little bit later on. But I would like to focus on the Romani communities and the cycle of persecution of many, not only many years, but many centuries of persecution that Roma communities were faced living in Europe and being later on intricate parts of the societies, but also neglected parts, ignored members of societies, and nowadays citizens, very proud citizens of many countries, but still condemned, I would say even, but for sure burdened with the stereotype of nomadism, of being free, of the romanticized version of themselves, that pop culture and culture in general kind of fed us through centuries and ages. That's why the stereotypes regarding Roma communities are very, very deeply rooted. And as we know, stereotypes are very hard and very difficult to change. And although I must say, the Romani Holocaust or the annihilation or extermination of Roma and Sinti groups during the Second World War is more and more well known in European communities and societies, which wasn't the case even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. But still, this is the only neutral information that we can encounter in the media or in any type of publications regarding Roma that are not scientific, are not kind of targeted at the communities or researchers, academics who are interested and passionate about cooperating with, working with issues and topics regarding Romani communities. But those deep roots are not only connected to the neutral images and information about the Roma and Sinti Holocaust, because they are mostly rooted to the more than 7 centuries presence of Romani communities in Europe, and many myths, many lies, many misconceptions, many half-truths that were popularized by literature, by common knowledge, and by stereotyping, of course, becoming parts of culture, becoming very, very permanent, and as I mentioned already, deeply rooted. And although, as I also said, the Romani Holocaust is more and more known, fortunately, and we as activists are very happy about it, but at the same time, still the situation before the Second World War and also after the Second World War have a lot of blank spots, a lot of misconceptions, and a lot of stereotyping as well connected to it. For example, before the Second World War, many Romani communities, just in the 20s, 30s, lived in many countries in a very integrated way, having their own companies, working in post offices, fighting in the army, for example, in the First World War, especially in Germany, in Wehrmacht. But still the imagery and the notions regarding Roma are very much connected to the image of a nomad that is naturally rooted anywhere, that is naturally connected to anybody or anything or any territory, and that's also kind of foreign, kind of alien to any of the civilized societies, like many European societies would like to see themselves. But the truth is that Romani communities lived in many different ways, in many different local communities. Some of the groups lived in a very integrative manner, some of the groups lived in an isolated manner, some of the groups lived on the margins, some of the groups were intellectuals, leaders of their local communities. But when looking at the persecution, not only during the Second World War, but generally through centuries, we can see that many of those intellectuals and intellectual elites of the Romani communities were actually annihilated or exterminated during different points in history. World War, of course, being the most recent and the most tragic one. And when talking about nowadays, talking about Roma exclusion and situation of Romani communities in different European states, it is often neglected to be stated the centuries, not years, not decades, but centuries of persecution, different types of persecution that Roma were targeted during almost the beginning of their presence in Europe. When Roma came to Europe, they were calling themselves pilgrims that were supposed to be having penance for their sins. For example, they were using a lot of biblical stories in order to adapt, to European societies, because during the time, we are talking about 14th and 15th century, God was in the center. We are talking about very, very theocratic, very God-oriented European societies and European states, of course, using the 19th and 20th century terminology, because it was very hard to talk about European societies at the time, but just to make things more simplify. So they were using that to adapt to the societies, to the people they met, to use the stories that were known to them. One of the stories was that, for example, there are descendants of the innkeeper who didn't let Maria, who was pregnant, to give birth in the inn, or the most famous, probably also explaining the nomadism of Roma people, was that they were descendants of the blacksmith who made the nails to the Christ cross. And because he started to be kind of haunted by the voices who said that he was a bad person, he is actually cursed, and he and all of his descendants will have to be won't be able to make any roots anywhere, to belong anywhere. They will always the sooner they feel comfortable, the faster they will have to leave that place. They will always have to be nomadic, perpetually moving from place to place as a punishment for making those nails. And they were using those stories in order to have some favor, because at that time, being a pilgrim meant that you were supported, you were given food, you were given temporary shelter, or you could stay for a while on the property of a certain person that was a Christian. And so that was a very good mechanism to somehow adapt and survive in medieval Europe. But very, very soon there were a lot of rumors started about Roma, about gypsies, to be historically correct, talking about them being spies for Ottomans, for Turks, during, of course, the very violent historical times between Turkish Empire and European countries, and also the religious clash, of course, and Roma being, or gypsies being spies not only for Turks but also wanted to harm the church and Christians, and that soon make Roma enemies, maybe not number one, but on the very top priority list of enemies of European societies. Roma were not only hunted, killed, exterminated. There were edicts, anti-gypsy edicts all over Europe. For example, not allowing them to enter certain territories, but also Roma were hunted like animals, unfortunately, in many territories like Germany, Netherlands, Switzerland, France. Still, we have a lot of historical books and testimonies showing how many foxes, how many deers, and how many gypsy kids, gypsy women, gypsy men were hunted and killed. And that is also a part of long-term strategy of dehumanizing Roma and showing Roma as being in between people, human beings, and animals, which became and proved to be very useful in many strategies leading to the Holocaust of Roma and Sinti, and proving them to be living on the margins of society, being asocial, and being outcast in between humans and animals. Roma were also, and I will come back to this point later on, Roma were also sent to colonies by those states who had colonies, and they were also subjected to slavery, which is also not very well known fact. Of course, when we are thinking slavery, we are thinking automatically almost about Afro-American community in US, but unfortunately, up until 1850s, half of the population of European Roma, European gypsies, were subjected to slavery, well, slaves. And after the abolition of slavery in 1851, many Roma started to migrate all over Europe. And for example, in Poland, we observed the migration of two groups from nowadays Romania, so the territories that we would call Romania right now, but at that time, part of the empire, and Lovari and Calderari, two groups came from those regions after the abolition of slavery, and many other countries as well experienced similar migration flows and influx. But after the exterminatory, so to speak, attitudes weren't as successful as some of the authorities and monarchies wanted them to be, unfortunately, they decided to move towards forced assimilation. They didn't first of all, they wanted, of course, to control any migratory activities and a nomadic mobility in order to first have taxes taken from those people, but at the same time to also be able to conscript them to army, because at that time, of course, a lot of wars internationally, but also domestically, were conducted by many different monarchs. But another strategy, of course, was to destroy the culture and destroy the language, which was, we can say, very common, unfortunately, a strategy towards many autochthonic communities all over the world. For example, in US, in Canada, in Australia, there were practices of taking the children from the families and putting them in different families or orphanages in order to minimize the contact with the culture of First Nations, for example, or any type of autochthonic communities. The same idea was also part of European Roma history. Marie Therese in 18th century in Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire, she decided to also very much forcibly assimilate Roma, starting with children, taking them away from their families, putting them in either orphanages or also sometimes in Hungarian families, in order to create the category in the second or third generation of so-called Új Magyar, so New Hungarian, a person of Romani origin, but without language, without culture, without any contact with culture, in order to destroy Romani cultures present in the empire. But also another instrument of this forced assimilation was to forbid any type of marriages among Roma men and women. So there was no endogamy allowed during that time. And many of those ideas were then picked up by other monarchs and other countries in order to forcibly assimilate Roma. Fact and also an interesting connection with this 18th century idea was also brought up in 2012 in Slovakia, where in debate started by the Ministry of Education in regards to somehow fight or minimize the influence of quote unquote very much degenerated culture on Romani children. The idea, which was very seriously discussed in Slovakia in 21st century, I must stress, to take the children from their families and put them in boarding schools, at least from Monday to Friday, in order to minimize their contact with the awful and bad Romani culture. Unfortunately, this idea was not accepted, but still, this is very troublesome and very dangerous to even discuss it on the public forum in order to somehow deal with the gypsy problem, quote unquote, once again, which is very oftenly one of the bases of anti-gypsism, socially motivated anti-gypsism, which I will also speak about a little bit. In order to come to somehow explain the solutions that are being brought up in order to save the children, which in itself is very colonial, paternalistic attitude towards Romani community or many minority communities by the dominant group. But at the same time, we would assume that in the 21st century, the awareness of such methods of eliminating the difference and the being very much against forced assimilation should be expected for European societies. Unfortunately, in case of Roma, it is very much openly accepted or neglected and ignored as an issue, that this type of ideas are being brought up when talking about Romani communities. And that's why one of the researchers, Aidan McGarry, called Romaphobia or anti-Gypsism the last acceptable racism in Europe, meaning that you can say whatever you want about Roma in the public sphere, and not many opposition will somehow commence after that. Not many people will be appalled by this type of statement, which are racist, which are discriminatory, but somehow when they are addressed towards Roma, are accepted widely, socially, not only accepted, but they are agreed with, which is very, very dangerous. Roma were also checked upon in many countries. They were also, we can say, pioneers of having IDs that we have, all of us have right now. But at the time, not many people outside of criminals had this type of IDs. It was first, especially in France, carnet anthropométrique, and then later on as, carnet de circulation, and then carnet anthropométrique, with also then fingerprints, as you can see. And that was in French legal system up until 2012, this type of control over Romani communities. Of course, it was a that act and that ruling, but at the same time, it was still present. Nobody cared to even abolish it from the French legal system up until 2012, when Romani organizations started to protest against this type of treatment and against this part of French legislature, and that was officially deleted from it. But still, for 100 years, it was part of the French system. And one of the Polish artists of Romani origin, a Roma PhD from the Academy of Arts in Krakow, Krzysztof Gil, he created one of his PhD installations based on the very not well-known part of Romani history in Europe, connected to the hauntings I already mentioned. It's a huge installation, which was then formed as part of a tent that you could come in and see and hear also Romani voices in the dark, which was supposed to emulate many times that many Romani families and in many countries had to hide in forests, had to hide after people wanted to hunt them, and then also during the Second World War persecute them, because many Roma were killed on the spot, not only in ghettos, not only in concentration camps, but also on the spot when met just on the travel. So it's a very powerful installation, and also an example of how Romani people, Romani leaders, Romani activists, Romani artists are also very actively trying to commemorate, trying to educate, and trying to disseminate the knowledge about the persecutions against Roma communities in centuries long, but also, of course, about the Roma and Sinti Holocaust. One of the examples of the neglect in regards to Roma is also this particular example of Setela Steinbach. Setela was a member of Dutch Sinti community, but for many years, up until the 90s, she was considered one of the faces, so to speak, of Jewish Holocaust, Jewish extermination during the Second World War. Only in the 90s, one of the reporters found out that Setela was part of the Sinti family in the Netherlands, and this part of Romani history was uncovered. But we don't know how many of such stories are still hidden, are still forgotten, are still neglected. And unfortunately, that's a very common part of Romani experience in regards to commemoration of their history and persecution that they encountered.